we bring jurors.
Judge, I think Madam Clerk was copying for us the originals, the last two things Mr. Arbor needed. I didn't have another copy.
Right. You just need them for cross-examination.
Yes,
All right.
Which we'll start.
and I mean, I don't realistically think I'll finish with the different ones today, and as long as I have them for the evening.
She'll be back in a minute. We can.
I mean, depending on what the thirty, but where you want to get going, I don't need any time, but I'll just look at it.
I think we can go ahead and move on, bring the jurors in, and then we'll make sure you have them in a timely fashion. Yes, please. Further questions, Mr. Fawcett?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Detective Morris, can I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
State Exhibit 88, which is the strength phone record of the defendant. Can you turn to the proper page of State Exhibit 88 that reflects April 22nd, 2013, all incoming and outgoing communications on cell phone records?
Yes, sir.
And can you, State's Exhibit 100, which is in evidence, appears to start at 7:26 a.m. on April 22nd.
Yes, sir.
Do you find that to be the first
Yes, sir. It's first,
communication?
yes, first
And
inbound phone call.
the last one at 4:09 p.m.? Do you see that on April 22nd?
At 4:09. Yes, sir.
Could you highlight all of those records between those dates and times? However you want to block it all.
Mm-hmm.
And for record purposes, that's on page, let's see, 22 of 23 of the records, bait stamp page 7115.
Yes, sir.
Purposes. Now, after that 4:09 p.m. call, there are other incoming calls to that device. There are other that are after the 5:20 that after 5:19 that afternoon, right?
Yes, sir. Several.
States Exhibit 100. That is that, to make this clear, this is every transaction from the defense cell phone records and States Exhibit 100.
Yes, sir. It is.
Okay. In States Exhibit 101, correct me if I'm wrong, is that every transaction from the phone record, States Exhibit 88, plus all of the iMessaging to and from the defendant, Mr. Broyhill's cell phone device during that relevant time frame?
Yes, it is.
All okay.
Correct.
Okay. state would formally move into evidence, states 121. Testified to is the layout, realtor's layout.
No objection on 121. It's allowed.
Detective Morse, your Friday, April 26th interview, at the end of the interview, did you ask the defendant if there was anything else that you hadn't asked that you thought that you should know to the defendant?
I did.
What did Mr. Broyhill respond to you?
He said no, sir.
Okay. I think you're covered. Does that sound like a quote of his? Yes, sir, I think you're covered.
Correct.
Thank you, Detective. I have no further questions.
Mr. Arbor, cross-examination, sir.
Yes, Your Honor. We finally get a chance to speak
Yes, sir.
formally,
Yes.
because you have been present in the courtroom throughout the entire trial to hear all of the testimony that's been said. I don't think you missed any of it.
Yes, sir.
So I'm going to ask you some questions now about this case, all right?
Yes, sir.
I'm not going to redo the whole role of a detective and police officer. You heard the testimony of the previous officers and detectives who have testified in this trial regarding the role of an officer, the role of a first responder, the role of a detective. Is there anything you heard from any of them that you would contest, dispute, or want to change with respect to anything you heard from any of those officers?
No, sir.
On what basis?
Sustained. That's the form of the
Note
quote.
my objection. Then we'll do it this way. Officer, how long you been a police officer again?
19 and a half years.
19 and a half years. And how many years were you a patrol officer?
9 years.
That was with the Raleigh Police Department.
Yes, sir.
And then you were a detective.
Correct.
And what kind of a detective were you at that time?
In November of 2004, I was promoted to detective. I spent the first 9 months as a detective in the fraud unit. I investigated financial crimes. And then I was transferred to the Special Victims Unit, where I investigated sex crimes against adults and children. In June of 2007, I was transferred to the Homicide Unit as my current assignment.
Let's back up a little bit more. Before you became a police officer, what kind of education and training did you get?
I have an associate's degree in law enforcement. I've transferred to a 4-year college, and when I did so, I lost credits, and I have 129 college credits towards a bachelor's degree, and I spent 6 months in the Raleigh Police Academy.
Where did you go to get the associate's degree?
Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont.
And you're right on the lake.
Yes, sir.
And where did you go to your 4-year school?
University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado.
You got around.
Yes, sir.
When did you move to Raleigh? Or I should say North Carolina.
In the fall of 1994.
So you've been here for a while.
Yes, sir.
When you me do a little math here. So 20 years takes us, you moved here around the time just prior to becoming a police officer. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
What'd you do before that?
I worked security at IBM
How long did you do that?
from September of 94 until October 30th of 1995 when I started the police academy.
Was that here in the Raleigh area?
RTP.
Okay. And when you went to the academy, did they train you in the preparation of police reports?
Yes, sir.
This was in preparation of becoming a patrol officer?
Yes, sir.
They gave you training, they taught you how to make arrests,
Yes, sir.
they taught you how to advise people of their rights,
Yes, sir.
they taught you how to take a statement,
Yes, sir.
they taught you how to document that statement
Yes, sir.
by generating it into a report similar to the ones that I have asked of other officers in this case. Would that be correct?
Yes, sir.
You finished the police academy. And when they put you out of the academy into the patrol car, assume that's what they did,
Yes.
they usually team somebody up who's new with an experienced officer to learn the ropes. Did they do that with you?
Yes, sir.
How long did you do that?
I was on field training for 6 months.
For 6 months, you rode along with another more experienced officer to learn the ropes of being a police officer.
Yes, sir.
And in the time you're doing that, you're participating and not just learning, you're also able to make arrests, because technically you are a police officer at that time, correct?
Yes, sir.
Even though you're a trainee.
Correct.
You heard testimony in this case from Officer Smith, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Officer Smith testified that he had a trainee with him in the car when he was on call the day that he came to this crime scene, correct?
Yes, sir.
I think that was Officer Hervey.
Yes.
Is that something similar to what you did as a trainee?
It's exactly the same thing.
Exactly the same thing. 1994. They have computers in the cars at that time?
When I started my field training, the first month there was no computer in the car, and after that first month, we started getting computers.
So you were in the group that first started to become a little more electronic,
Yes, sir.
which meant that when you got all that training, they showed you how to do it on typewriters and stuff before you got the computer, right?
We were handwriting them.
So you did all that, and then all of a sudden it was thrown out the window because they handed you this little box that could do it for you, or help you do it.
Correct.
In the time that you were a patrol officer, you were engaged in investigations similar to other, let's stick with you. You make any arrests in the time that you were a patrol officer?
Yes, sir.
How many did you make, if you had to guess?
Probably 100.
Were you a road officer for a while?
Correct myself. While I was on training, probably 100. No, of course, 9 years. I was patrol officer for 9 years.
I was gonna say 100 sounds a little low, right?
Correct.
If you added up all the citations you wrote, people you had to arrest for other stuff, we're probably talking definitely in the hundreds, maybe 1,000.
1,000.
And with each of those cases that you have to make an arrest, there was somebody asking you to generate a report, correct?
Some type of report, yes, sir.
When you are a patrol officer and you rise to the ranks of a detective, it's not an automatic process, is it?
No, sir.
You have to aspire to want to be a detective, correct?
Yes, sir.
They just don't grab somebody out of a car and say, here, give me your nightstick, here's a pad and paper, you're a detective. It doesn't work like that, does it?
No, sir.
You have to ask to be a detective. You have to take a test to be a detective, right?
Correct.
You have to do well on the test, and then you have to be offered the position of detective when one opens up, correct?
Correct.
And this is a fairly big department, the Raleigh Police Department, correct?
Yes, sir.
It's the only police department you've ever worked for, right?
Yes, sir.
And so in the time frame that you do that, you have to wait for people to retire, or some people move on, and when there's an opening, and you've taken the test, you're waiting in line, you get the call. And they say,
Correct.
but it's still not an automatic thing, is it?
No, it's not.
You have to go for training.
Yes.
Even though you went to the academy, even though you went to those classes in college, now you're doing a different job, isn't that correct?
It is a completely different job. Yes, sir.
Because when you're a police officer, you're essentially enforcing the law as a patrol officer, correct?
Correct. It's one of the duties.
You have some investigative responsibilities. Like I asked some of the patrol officers, and Ms. Elliott asked one of the patrol officers about asking questions. You had to do some of that when you were a patrol officer with the Raleigh Police Department, correct?
Absolutely.
You had to do that lots of times, right?
Yes, sir.
You had to generate reports about the investigations that you did, correct?
Yes, sir.
When you aspire to become a detective, the role changes to one of not as much enforcement. There is enforcement involved in it, correct?
There is.
But now there's a sort of a increased accent on investigation, correct?
Yes.
When you become an investigative officer, you are then trained in a number of different skills that sometimes are a little more advanced than what they gave you in the academy to be a patrol officer. Would that be fair?
Absolutely.
Some of the work you have to do involves doing more detailed reports than what you might have done before, correct?
Yes, sir.
Because as an investigator, one of the roles of a detective is that after a crime has been committed that cannot be investigated and assessed by a, say, patrol officer, it's something that requires additional investigation. The way a police department is set up is there's a detective bureau so that you can call officers who are trained in investigation to go into a crime scene and see if they can find out what happened, correct?
Most of the time, yes.
There are many things you have to do as a detective that don't always are skills that you necessarily get to use as a patrol officer. That be fair?
Yes, sir.
You have to sometimes go undercover.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever have to do any of that?
No, sir.
Undercover officers or officers who go out sometimes pose to be someone else, correct?
Correct.
They have to be trained in how to pretend to be someone they're not, so that they can infiltrate perhaps some criminal activity in some fashion and have people. It's a way of gathering information, correct?
Yes, sir.
It's particularly used in drugs and vice, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ever work drugs and vice?
No, sir.
When you become a detective, they train you about all those skills, don't they?
Undercover work or additional training?
Additional training to do undercover work.
If you are selected to do undercover work, absolutely.
And even if you're not going to be the undercover officer, you have to be aware of how that happens, right? You have to have some of the skills, not necessarily use them, but you're aware of them.
I'm aware of them, yes.
Otherwise, you wouldn't know what the other detectives are doing that you work with, correct?
Potentially, yes.
Sometimes undercover officers go into crime scenes where they have to pretend to be someone else, and there's other officers, typically detectives, who are observing and watching and gathering intelligence while it's going on, right? Sometimes.
I'm not aware of any, but it's possible.
Well, when they do an undercover buy, on a drug case, for example, they might take a detective and dress him up like a street thug and send him out on the street to buy drugs from a drug dealer.
Absolutely.
And while that's going on, there might be a couple of detectives who are around the corner observing the thing, correct?
Sure.
They might be used as undercover officers, but they also might just be there to investigate, observe, watch, and arrest somebody if the transaction goes down.
Correct.
And you're familiar with all these procedures.
Yes, sir.
Part of investigation as a detective is being able to identify people. In other words, when I say that, sometimes people say this happened, I don't know who it is. You're skilled in gathering from them the information that you need to try to make an identification of the person who might have committed the crime, right?
Yes, sir.
You ask questions like how tall, what do they look like, things of that nature. And you receive training on how to do that, right?
Yes, sir.
One of the things you have to do when you're a police officer, detective, like you did in this case, evidence. You know that sometimes, like this case, evidence has to be procured and sometimes preserved so that it can be used in a trial like this, correct?
Absolutely.
You get training in that, right?
Yes, sir.
One of the things you have to do is interview people. That's a big part of being a detective, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And they train you how to do that.
Yes.
You know what an interview is, right?
Yes, sir.
You know what an interrogation is, right?
Yes, sir.
They're different, aren't they?
They are.
An interview is when you're asking somebody something to try to find out something that happened. Isn't that correct?
Correct. It's more of a conversation.
An interrogation is when you talk to somebody and you sort of have an idea of what they've already done and you're trying to get them to confess to it. Isn't that correct?
Correct. It's a little more confrontation.
Use different skills in an interview than you do in an interrogation, don't you?
Yes, sir.
There's a variety of different skills that you use in an interrogation that are completely different from an interview. Isn't that true?
Correct.
When you're doing an interview, you're trying to find out something about what happened, correct?
Yes, sir.
When you're doing an interrogation, you already have some idea what happened. You're just trying to lock it down.
Yes, sir.
Now, when you're a detective, and since we're doing this, give me a little background on your detective responsibilities. What have you done prior to being a homicide detective?
First 9 months, I was assigned to the fraud unit. I investigated financial crimes,
Like, give us an example.
embezzlement, financial card theft, counterfeit checks, worthless checks.
Now, in a lot of those cases, there's a lot of paper chasing you have to do.
Yes, sir.
There was some paper chasing you had to do in this case, right?
Yes, sir.
Some of the skills that you developed when you were a detective in that field came useful here.
Sure.
When you're doing check fraud, and I don't know, did you do welfare fraud? Sometimes they have a separate person for welfare fraud.
No, welfare fraud was handled by the state.
You're doing check fraud or embezzlement from a company. One of the skills you're taught or get practiced in is how to look at records, and you get somebody who calls and says they're taking money. We suspect them of taking money. And one of the things you have to do is go back and look at all the records and see if you can find a trail where money is missing, correct?
Yes.
And then see if it connects to a particular employee. correct?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes an employer will call and say, we have a certain suspicion of who's doing the embezzlement. We don't have proof of it, right?
Correct.
And as the detective, when you get a call like that, you go in and the examination of records is to see if it's that person first, correct?
Right.
And then if you find a trail that supports that, then there's another process you have to follow, correct?
Yes.
Which is the confrontation of that person who you now have reason to believe has committed a crime.
It can be either an interview or an interrogation.
Right. Because once you've got, say, some proof, but it's not conclusive proof, it might be an interview.
Absolutely.
Because the interview is trying to see whether the person tells you something that maybe it explains why they have. For example, if their name's showing up and there's money missing, and you're not sure that it's being stolen, could be legitimate, right?
Exactly.
And when you do an interview, the purpose is really it's a fact-finding mission, right?
Correct.
You're going to ask questions to see whether or not maybe this person, maybe they can give you something that makes a logical explanation for why their name is showing up near the money that appears to be missing. Correct?
Exactly.
And sometimes that happens.
Absolutely.
Sometimes in doing an interview, you get that explanation and you go back to the employer and say, there's no embezzlement, or we don't see it.
You're right.
Sometimes when you're doing that check and you're looking, you come across information that seems, that's pretty confident, this person's doing something wrong, correct?
Yes.
Now, when you go to talk to that same person, it's not so much an interview as much as it is an interrogation. Would that be fair?
Me personally, I tend to lean more towards the interview.
The skills are different.
They are.
In an interrogation, when you have reason to believe that a crime has been committed, and that the person that you're talking to is the one who's committed the crime, there's a whole plethora of skills that are taught to you on how to get that information from that person, right?
Correct.
Different detectives use different methods,
Absolutely.
just like different lawyers have different ways of questioning people.
Right.
Some detectives will get in the person's face and get very confrontational, correct?
They do.
Some might come in and put an arm around their shoulder and act like they're their long-lost pal from the army or something to get them relaxed, so they might start talking, right?
Yes, sir.
I'll ask you a characterization to you and ask you if you agree or disagree. You sort of keep a same demeanor. You sort of keep a business-like demeanor when you're doing your interviews and interrogations. Would that be fair?
I do. Yes, sir.
Because that way, and that's a skill, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's not just done randomly.
No.
It's done with the intent of you're not hired as a detective to just ask questions all the time of people who are suspected of a crime.
Right, you're not.
You're hired to, once you've got the suspicion and there's reasonable suspicion or even probable cause to believe that the person needs to be arrested, you're not asking questions anymore for the purpose of finding out what happened. You've already developed that reasonable suspicion or probable cause in some cases. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And when that's happened, your job isn't to go in just to ask questions. Your job is to go in and get statements from the person that are intended to incriminate them, correct?
Yes, sir.
I mean, it's a skill,
Yes, sir.
and you're trained that skill.
Trained and you develop it over time. Yes, sir.
You're pretty good at it.
Thank you.
You're a homicide detective.
Yes, sir.
I'll ask you the question. You don't just get to be a homicide detective, do you?
No, sir.
You do.
Absolutely.
How many detectives are in the Raleigh Police Department? You know how big the whole department is, officers and sergeants and...
It's about 800 sworn officers.
How many homicide detectives are there?
10.
You're an elite group. You're part of an elite group, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
Offered the job that you had, detective, because you weren't good at the other jobs that you had previous to becoming a homicide detective. Would that be fair?
Correct.
Let's talk about lead detective. You and I joked the other day, right?
Yes, sir.
You, because you're Superman. But it's not, doesn't work that way, does it?
No.
It's a rotation.
Correct.
You're just next up on the list.
Exactly.
Homicides, unfortunately, law enforcement. It's one of the worst crimes that
Yes, sir.
it carries with it, and you know this as part of your work, serious consequences to the offender, correct?
Absolutely.
Raleigh Police Department, when you go to these trainings, you're not just Raleigh police officers, correct?
No, they're detectives from several different agencies.
You can even go to trainings that are out of state where other detectives do things, right?
Yes, sir.
Have you done any of that?
Yes, sir.
And that's,
No, it's fairly standard.
yeah, they want you to get the training as much as you can in the elite group dealing with the most serious crime, right?
Correct.
And in 13, it was your turn.
Yes, sir.
And I believe you got your call to be involved in this case sometime after 6 o'clock on that day. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, remember where you were?
Yes, I do.
Where were you?
I was on duty and I was at the office.
Where's the office?
Atlantic Avenue, 4520 Atlantic Avenue.
Call comes in that there's this homicide that's happened over at 1705 Tealwood Place, correct?
I heard it dispatched on the radio as a stabbing.
As a stabbing.
Yes, sir.
At the time that the call came in, at that point, nobody was yet dead, correct?
No, sir.
But that doesn't mean that the Homicide Bureau doesn't always get involved, even at that stage, correct?
Correct.
You got a stabbing, you got someone who's seriously injured to the point where the police officers on the scene think this thing could turn into a homicide, correct?
Correct.
Better get one of the homicide guys on this right away, correct?
Yes.
You don't wait for the person to pass away, because there's reasons for that too, isn't there?
Yes.
All the things that I just talked about.
Yes, sir.
Evidence preservation, getting statements, interviews, interrogations if necessary, to get the information, to do it and do it right, because it's a serious case, correct?
Exactly.
one of the things you're gonna have to do is sort of coordinate all of the different witnesses, agencies, any other officers, other detectives, anything that touches this case as the lead detective, you're sort of in charge of getting it all together, correct?
Correct. A lead detective doesn't have any supervisory responsibilities or duties, but they are the focal point of collecting, and all the reports are submitted to that lead detective. Yes.
So that it's not getting handed off from one person to the next person to the next person. There's a point person who's sort of like in charge of that case. You're in charge of this case.
Yes, sir.
Now, you heard retired Detective Gill testify, correct?
Yes, sir.
In fact, he had some involvement in this case, correct?
Yes.
Detective Smith testified. He was not part of the homicide unit at that time, but he had some involvement in this case, right?
Yes.
You get a homicide, particularly a stabbing, multiple parties. You heard testimony in this trial of a lot of different police officers arriving at the scene of 1705 Tealwood Place on April 22nd. And as the lead detective being assigned to handle this case, your job is to get in the car, head on over there, and start to see what you got on your hand here. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
And that's what you did.
Yes, sir.
You generated throughout, and then you stay involved in this case till it comes to something like this, a trial, correct?
Yes, sir.
Unless something happens to you or you get promoted, and even then, sometimes when you get promoted, if it was your case, you stay on it until it's done, right?
Correct. Even if you're promoted, you keep the case until the end.
If you retire or something, that might get you off of it, but you haven't done that yet.
That's it.
When you got to the crime scene, the first thing you do is interview as many officers as you can to gather whatever information you can, to sort of get a lay of the land, to sort of understand what you're dealing with, correct?
Correct. I try to speak to a supervisor on scene or detectives on scene that may have been working the case up to that point to get an idea of where we're at.
I'm going to have you walk us through that a little more specifically, and there's been this testimony in this case of what was happening in the intersection area of Rainwater Drive and Tealwood and Teal Briar, which we now know is the same street. It just changes its name as it crosses Rainwater, correct?
Right.
You heard my testimony, or sorry, my question about Rainwater Drive. It's a connecting drive between two busier streets, Spring Forest, I think the other one's Hunting Ridge or something.
Hunting Ridge. Yes, sir.
And it is a spur street. There's a lot of spur streets that come off of Rainwater that is where the homes for this community is, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you've heard testimony about that this event happened sometime after 5 o'clock that afternoon, correct?
Yes, sir.
Matter of fact, because you're gathering all of the information, that's one of the things you're going to try to lock down is when did this thing happen, correct?
Yes, sir.
So when you get to the crime scene, tell us what you do.
When I first get to the crime scene, I generally get an overview of what is in front of me.
How do you do that?
I'm just making sure that the crime scene is secured with crime scene tape, that I don't have unnecessary people in the crime scene itself.
What do you mean by unnecessary?
Media, citizens, extra officers, just in the crime scene.
How do you do it?
I visually look.
How do you lock it down? How do you secure it?
That is done before my arrival, and that's done by patrol officers. Patrol officers will use crime scene carrier, and they'll also use their, if
Heard me
necessary.
ask all that are in place, correct?
Yes,
You're familiar with all those protocols, right?
yes, sir.
And the officers who were on the crime scene, they had the training that teaches them the same protocols as well, correct?
Yes, sir.
Everything looked like the protocols were being applied that day?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Go ahead. Tell us what you did.
Once I realized that the crime scene tape was all up and that police cars were blocking traffic and there was no unnecessary traffic, people or cars in the crime scene, which it was done, I met with a couple of detectives that were already on scene or a supervisor and got a briefing on what had taken place up to this point when I arrived.
What they do with the traffic trying to get up and down Rainwater?
They had a patrol car blocking rainwater at Spring Forest Road and then further down Rainwater, which I couldn't see from where I was at.
So people couldn't come in or out at that time?
Correct. Rainwater was completely shut down.
Go ahead. What else did you do?
Like I said, I met with Detective Fry. He devised
Who's
it.
he?
He is an aggravated assault detective that responded to the scene.
When there's a call, and there was some testimony about this, when there's a call on something like a homicide, any detectives who might be on duty or nearby can offer their assistance, other officers, they typically respond to a scene like that, don't they?
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
I also met with, you know, the supervisors on scene.
Who was your supervisor, if you recall?
My supervisor was Sergeant Cashwell.
Was he there?
He showed up. He was initially responding to the hospital and then came out to the scene, yes.
Okay.
And I'd gotten a briefing on what had taken place as far as interviews that had been conducted, statements obtained, and where we were in the process of our searches, CCBI's response.
How many officers did you talk to?
At the scene right then,
Yeah.
it would have been only one or two. Most of my information that I get at the scene when I arrive is from supervisors who have obtained this information from those officers themselves. So I don't have to go talk to 50 officers. I can just go talk to one or two people.
You remember who you talked to?
Patrol officers?
Yeah.
No, sir.
You remember how many you talked to?
Like I said, it would have been just one or two. I typically don't go to all officers on the scene to get their individual statements at this point. It is mainly I go to one or two people that are on scene, supervisors or senior detective, to get an idea of what taken place up to the point prior to my arrival.
Yeah, that's one of the protocols. You're not randomly just stopping everybody with a badge and saying, what do you know about this, right?
No, that's not the time or place to do that now.
No. You ascertain who are the people that have the information about this case that have been gathering it prior to your arrival. And those are the people you go and talk to.
Correct.
Now, there might be somebody out there that saw something, an officer who saw something, did something, participated in something. You don't know about it yet, but you're going to find out eventually, right?
Yes, sir.
Because if you don't know right then, those officers have all been taught, do reports, write down what you did, and if it was important, they're going to put it down in a supplement, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, you draft a document called a Raleigh Police Department Case Information Update.
Yes, sir.
When did you do that?
I'd have to actually look at the update, give you the date.
Would refresh your recollection and take a look at it?
Yes, sir.
Put me on 3 and 5.
Detective Morse, take a look at Defendant's Exhibit 14, marked for identification. I'll ask you to look at it and tell me if that looks like your Raleigh Police Department case information update.
Yes, sir.
Does that help refresh your recollection as to when you would have prepared that report?
No, it does not. The date on here is the date of the offense. It wouldn't be uncommon for this to be created a day, 2, 3 days, 4 days after the fact.
So you don't have any recollection of when you wrote this?
No, sir, not by looking at this document, no.
All right. But there's no question in your mind that this is the document that you drafted?
Correct.
What do they do this for?
This is created, and it just gives a little snippet of the investigation early on. It can be, like I said, it can be created that day, 2 or 3 days afterwards, and it's distributed through email up the chain for cases that may generate media attention. So if the media were to call and inquire about a specific case to the chief or to the public relations officer, they have some knowledge of the investigation.
And as you sit here today, you don't remember when you wrote it?
Correct. By looking at this document, I wouldn't be able to tell you if it was that day, the next day, or a day, 2 days, 3 days afterwards.
Okay, that's from looking at the document. I'm asking you from your personal recollection. You don't recall when you wrote this,
No, sir.
but you know for a fact that you did.
Yes, sir.
You write down all kinds of pertinent information on this form, don't you?
Yes, sir.
For example, the report time. You marked down the report time is 17:19, correct?
That is the reported time of the incident, which we get from the 911 call. Yes, sir.
Exactly. Now, you know a lot of information beyond the time that you wrote this case information update that you didn't know when you drafted this form, right?
Correct.
Because you've been the lead detective in this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in the course of preparing this case for trial, more than 8,000 pages of documentation has been prepared in this case, correct?
I'm not sure of the number, but I'm sure it's up there, yes.
You wouldn't contest that number,
I would
you?
not, no.
You wouldn't contest me saying that, would you?
No, it seems probably right.
That's just the documentation. There's discs with some of the information that you just testified to about things that were pulled off of people's phones and their computers and internet searches. You had to do all that too, right?
Yes, sir.
Because the suspect in this case was never really at issue, was it?
No, sir.
Mr. and Mrs. Hahn went across the street and at some point caused a neighbor, Angela Cabe, to call 911 at 5:19 p.m. on April 22nd. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's what you put in the report, the case information update, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's where that time comes from, correct?
Yes, sir.
That's not a speculation. That's a time that the phone call was received by the 911 dispatch unit connected to the Raleigh Police Department, correct?
Exactly.
And they calibrate that time to make sure it's working accurately, correct?
I don't know. I would hope so.
You rely on it, right?
I do.
You testify to it in court about things, and when they give you a date and time and say this is when the call came in, you testify and tell people that's what it is, right?
Yes, sir.
And that's what's happened here, correct?
Yes, sir.
So based on your understanding, and I understand you're not there at the crime scene when it's happening, but based upon your understanding, and if everything's working right, Angela Cabe called in at 5:19 on April 22nd, correct?
Correct.
Now, at some point, you wrote a summary, which is in the body of this case information update, right?
Yes, sir.
Who is this for? Who reads this?
Again, this is generated and it's sent through email up the chain of command all the way up to the chief for cases that may generate media attention.
There's some words in italics next to the heading of summary on this report. That is by the way, this document, this is a form, right?
Yes, it is a form.
This is something that you pull it up on your computer at work, case information update, and you fill in the blanks, right?
Correct. You fill in the blanks.
Date, 4/22/13, correct?
Yes.
That's the date of the crime.
Yes, sir.
Submitted by Z.A. Morse, that's you, correct?
Yes, sir.
And et cetera, all the way down. You put in the offense, type of offense. You put in assault/knife, correct?
Yes, sir.
The case gets assigned a case number. You put that on, right?
Yes, sir.
Because all the evidence, all the reports, everything that is done with respect to this case will reference back to that case number, correct?
Exactly.
That way, everything can stay collectible, findable, usable, particularly for an event like this, a trial, correct?
Yes, sir.
You write down the location, 1705 Tealwood Place, correct?
Yes, sir.
The victim, Jamison Kirk Hahn. You do the same for Mr. Hahn and the suspect, Mr. Broyhill, correct?
Yes, sir.
You include information like their dates of birth, their license numbers, their social security numbers, correct?
Yes, sir.
The addresses where they live, correct?
Yes, sir.
I mean, you don't just get this stuff out of thin air. You had to gather this information up before you could sit down and write this document, right?
Exactly.
When you get to the part about summary and it's in italics, it says right on it. It says a number of things, but it also says it's preliminary in nature and subject to revision as the investigation continues, correct?
Yes, sir.
As you said, it's a preliminary report.
Exactly.
In your summary, you indicated that officers responded to a stabbing at this location that the jury's heard about, correct?
Yes, sir.
You said that the victims were found about 50 yards from their home at 1705 Tealwood Place, correct?
Correct.
That the female victim in the case had sustained multiple stab wounds, correct?
Yes, sir.
That the male victim had sustained lacerations to his hand, correct?
Yes, sir.
That the suspect, which referred to Mr. Broyhill in the previous entries, was found back at the residence and taken into custody, correct?
Yes, sir.
You wrote down that all three were transported to Wake Medical Center, right?
Yes, sir.
You wrote down that the female's victim's injuries were life-threatening, correct?
Yes, sir.
You wrote down that the male victim's injuries were not life-threatening, correct?
Correct.
Now, you haven't, when you're writing this thing, you have not necessarily talked to or seen or spoken to anybody in regards to the victims or the suspect, correct?
I have talked to other detectives that are involved or officers that may have conducted preliminary interviews.
When you wrote down, you wrote down the suspect's injuries are not life-threatening, you had not yet talked to Officer Smith, had you?
I personally had not, no.
You had not seen Mr. Broyhill's injuries, had you?
I had not seen him, no.
You'd not been to Wake Med to see him yet.
No, sir.
You'd not talked to any doctors there yet.
Me personally, no.
But you wrote that in because someone related that to you.
Yes, sir.
Didn't mean it's accurate. It's what they said.
Correct.
You've now heard testimony in this trial that his injuries were quite significant, weren't they?
They were.
His wrists were cut open down to the bone, both of them, right? That was the testimony.
I don't recall.
You don't recall Officer Smith's testimony?
I recall Officer Smith's testimony, just not to the extent of the injuries being down to the bone. I just know he had significant injuries.
That they looked like they filleted?
That I recall, yes, sir.
That they looked grotesque?
Yes.
That they were serious?
Yes.
That he stabbed himself in the stomach and his guts were hanging out?
Yes, sir.
Those could be life-threatening injuries, don't you agree?
If he doesn't receive medical attention, certainly.
You weren't trying to be inaccurate. It's just someone told you that in your gathering of information, and that's what you wrote in this summary, correct?
Yes, sir.
There was a whole entry about who these people were and what their relationship was to each other, correct?
Yes.
Some of it, not all of it, consistent with what we've heard in the trial, correct?
Yes, sir.
Then there was an entry about what you were able to ascertain from that day about why this might have happened, correct?
Correct. It was speculation.
I understand that. But that's what you're writing down in your summary. Something about why this might have happened, what attempts there have been made to try to find out why this happened, correct?
Correct.
You wrote down that the male victim and the suspect had been lifelong friends since well, you put the age of 14, correct?
Correct.
I don't even know if at that point you didn't make comment of it, the fact that there was an age difference. You'd come to learn that at a later time, right?
Correct. I did.
I mean, you had date of birth up there in the bio information, but that's what's being said. Somebody said they've known each other since 14 years old.
Exactly.
And that's what you're writing in. You wrote in that they just came back from the beach, right?
Yes, sir.
And when you drafted this report, whenever that was, you wrote at this time, there is no indication as to what caused the victim to attack the female victim.
Correct.
Because on the day of April 22nd, 2013, there wasn't one, was there?
At that very moment, no, sir.
You knew that Mrs. Hahn had owned a fundraising company because that, again, like everything else in this form, was shared with you.
Yes, sir.
One of the things you're going to do as a detective after this, sometime after this thing is drafted, is you're going to go out and start to see whether everything that's in this is accurate.
Yes, sir.
If it's not, you're going to fix that down the road. That's one of your jobs as the lead detective, is to get things accurate, correct?
Sure.
Now, you made an entry, whenever you wrote this, that there's speculation suspect may have embezzled some money from one of the accounts and has been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that the extent of the cancer has not been determined, correct?
Correct.
On April 26th, when you're going to talk to him on this interview that the state has chosen to play for you, play for the jury, You're asking him the question, you don't have cancer. Isn't that when you asked Mr. Broyhill that? You were asking him, you don't have cancer, do you? That's one of the things you asked him.
Yes, sir.
And he said yes, right?
He told me he did not.
But that question didn't come out of thin air, did it?
No, sir.
I mean, you just don't go to someone who's saying he's got cancer. You just go up to him and say, you don't have cancer, do you? That's a hunch. That would be a hunch if you did that, right?
Exactly.
Somebody had to give you some information in between, right?
Not necessarily, no.
You might have gathered it on your own.
True.
You might have gathered it from my client.
Objection.
On what basis?
What's the basis for your objection?
Hearsay at that point.
Sustained.
All right, we can do this all kinds of ways. Detective Morse? On April 26th of 2013, when you interviewed my client, that was not the first time that you had interviewed my client. Is it?
No, it was not.
It is also not the first time that my client was interviewed and recorded. Isn't that correct?
No, it was not.
It wasn't Detective Gill who went with you on April 23rd, the day after this thing happened. It was Detective Gibney. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you went to Wake Med Hospital the day after this happened to conduct an interview of my client. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
You asked questions of my client.
Yes, sir.
You received responses from my client.
Yes, sir.
Now, prior to going there, that was about 1:30 in the afternoon on the 23rd, wasn't it? If you know.
1:30 in the afternoon on the 23rd. Yes, sir.
You would have had time in between the 22nd, when you showed up at the crime scene, and 1:30 in the afternoon on the 23rd, to attempt to do more investigation into this case. Wouldn't that be correct?
Yes, sir.
In that investigation, there have been some witnesses that testified that were participants in that investigation, not just some of the officers who arrived on the scene, correct?
Yes, sir.
CCBI came out. That's the City and County Bureau of Identification, correct?
Yes, sir.
Stacy Johnson came out, correct?
She did.
Took photographs, trails, gather evidence, correct?
Yes, sir.
Other officers put up tape. Make sure nobody climbs over the crime scene, steps in something they're not supposed to, compromises the scene, correct? Correct.
Yes, sir.
Officers are taking interviews of some, like the Heralds. Mrs. Harrell was here. The Caves, Mrs. Cave. You're not having to do all that. There's other officers working on this thing, correct?
Yes, sir.
At this location, correct?
Yes, sir.
In fact, when this thing happened, correct?
They did.
And they had to be what you call as staged away from the crime scene, correct?
Yes, sir.
Because they're asking people things, well, they want to get a story out of this, right? Untypical in a homicide case, right?
No.
So they're asking questions of people and trying, purpose, this is different. They want to tell a story on the news, right?
Exactly.
At this point, you're trying to gather information. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Search warrants, right? There's things that into. The house has to be searched, correct?
Yes, sir.
There's cars in the driveway. There's a car in the front of the house, correct?
Yes, sir.
The interviews suggest that these cars might have information. We're going to secure it. We're going to find it, and then we're going to get permission to go look into it and see what's in those things, correct?
Permission or search warrant. Yes, sir.
You see any evidence laying around? CCBI's marking it like they did in this case. Put a little placard down, take a picture. Some like shoes on the grass. Let's get that picture of that. That's to all help you put this thing together in case this thing has to come to a trial like this, correct?
Yes, sir.
You went into the house,
I did.
which is protocol for the lead detective. Go in and look at the crime scene, right?
Yes, sir.
You've done this before. This wasn't your first time.
Several times.
You mentioned things like the backpack that you saw on the stool, right?
Yes, sir.
Talked about in your testimony before things that were found in the backpack, correct?
Yes, sir.
Sometime after midnight, the processing and the searching of the residence was completed, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you went back to the station.
Yes, sir.
There's a number of different items that were collected and packaged at the crime scene. And you did some of that too, right?
Yes, sir.
That means gathering evidence, put it in an envelope, mark it, put the case number on it, initial it, date it. It's going to go into an evidence locker at your station, right?
Yes, sir.
Following protocols.
Yes, sir.
And by the time you got there that night, after midnight, it's really early morning at that point on the 23rd, you still don't have a reason for why this happened developed, do you?
No, sir.
Mr. Arbor will break and resume tomorrow morning at 9:30. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be in recess till 9:30. If you'll follow the instructions I've given you, don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about the case. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters, and please have no conversation or communication with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. Please leave your notebooks and all of your papers in your chair there. We'll collect everything except your notebooks over the evening. And if you'll gather in the deliberation room tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you very much for your service. You may step down, sir. Outside the presence of the jury, are there matters that we need to take up before we recess?
Not from the state, Your Honor.
Not this time.
All right, very good. We'll be in recess then until 9:30 tomorrow morning.
I'm sorry, Your Honor, there is something. We have, I'm advised this is, I'm not holding him to it, but this may be Mr. Fawcett's last witness.
Yes, that's my expectation, it's very moment.
Well, and I'm not holding him to it. I mean, he can call whoever he wants. He hasn't rested. But we may get to a point tomorrow where we may finish, and it might be before 5 o'clock. We have witnesses that we intend to call as witnesses in this case on behalf of the defense. I know we have some other procedural matters we would have to address. But permission to not stay, if that were not an inconvenience to the court's schedule. So that I don't anticipate that our witnesses will go anywhere near as long as the state's case. I think it'll get done maybe a little more. I think did lose some days with weather, but we're close to what the prediction was. And beyond that, I think we'll be in a posture that after that to close. So rather than start the defense and have to break it up, and particularly have to break up a witness, don't anticipate being terribly long. Hopefully, yes, that we not have to, if we finish at some point tomorrow, break, at least allow the jury to leave, do whatever we can do at that point without the jury present, and not commence defenses until Monday morning.
All right. And I think I know the answer. I anticipate going another half an hour of cross-examination. Right, so I expect we'll use certainly most of that, your best guess.
I would think.
All right. In that case, that'll be fine. I think the jurors have been working hard, and breaking early on Friday would be a welcome for them as well. So
I would appreciate that, Your Honor.
we plan on doing that then. There will be some matters, if the state rests tomorrow, there will be some matters for us to take up outside of that. And then anticipate recessing ourselves for the remainder of the day. That's fine. All right, very good. Then we'll be in recess until 9:30 tomorrow morning.